Welcome everyone to today's Performance and Sports Science Study Group webinar. My name is Daniel Yu. I'm the sports scientist for the Orlando Magic. My co-host is Nick Simi. He's the head athletic trainer and physical therapist for the Grand Rapids Gold, the Denver Nuggets G League team. Unfortunately, he won't be able to make it here with us, but we're super excited to host Dr. Yasuki. He's the assistant professor at Texas Tech and the director of their sport performance lab. I'm especially excited because he is also the author of our NSCA CPSS chapter on environmental stress. And as the author, he'll be able to share how these concepts apply in practice. If you have any questions, please leave it in the chat and we will address them during the Q&A post-presentation. But without further ado, Dr. Yasuki, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Danielle. Thank you so much for everyone joining today's lectures. Also, thank you for people who watch the video later, not in live sessions. As Danielle introduced me, my name is Dr. Yasuki Sekiguchi. I'm assistant professor, director of sports performance lab at the Department of Kinesiology and Sports Management at the Texas Tech Universities. As he said, we wrote the chapter of the environmental physiology for the CPSS textbook. So I'm excited when he reached out to me to talk about this in this lecture series. Me and Danielle actually went to the Yukon at the same time when I was doing the PhD. So we knew each other before these lectures too. So I'm excited doing this anyways. So my topic is practical consideration in the heat mitigation strategy to enhance exercise performance. So in the environmental chapters, we talk about other factors, for example, hydrations, coolings, and also altitude and stuff, but we are going to focus on the heat today, just due to the time sake and other reasons. Okay, so just quick information about myself. My name, I did my undergrad in Kobe, in Japan, and I did my master at the University of Arkansas. I did my PhD at the Yukon at the College Seminar Institute and the postdoc at the Yukon as well. Now I'm assistant professor at the Texas Tech Universities. So I'm moving from SEC to Big East and the Big 12 right now. And a quick introduction about my lab. And my lab, I have 4 PhD students, 4 master students, 6 undergraduate students right now. There are 3 different, 3 big categories of the studies and the sports science area that we work. First one is optimizing hydration status, how to mitigate the negative impact of dehydration type of stuff. And the second one, enhancing thermoregulatory response, which is the topic of today's heat acclimation, heat acclimatization, and coolings. The third one is training role recovery and sleep monitoring to enhance performance and prevent injuries. So this is more sports science stuff. So we don't consider these 3 different areas totally separate. We work for the teams not only in the lab but also on the field too. We combine all these 3 areas together and comprehensively work for the athlete to improve the performance and health. This is my lab, and like on the top left corner, this is the team for this year's. And some of the ongoing projects that we are doing research-wise, the one with the heat acclimation study, we are looking at the sex difference in the performance and the physiological adaptations due to the heat acclimations. Excuse me. This study is funded by the World Athletics, and we are looking at hydration, the neuromuscular performance and injury before and after intermittent exercise. And we do some wearable work to, for example, excuse me, real-time hydration assessment device, non-invasive core assessment device. This is funded by Air Force. And we do a lot of work for the training and recovery monitoring for the Texas Tech Athletics too. Me personally working for the Olympics teams too, and which I'm going to talk some data or some information from Paris Olympics too today. But including myself and my student work with athletics a lot here at the Texas Tech too. So in short, like we are doing a lot of sports science work for the college and professional area, not only in our lab settings for the research, but also on the field settings for the sports science consulting purpose too. Okay, so let's get into the actual presentations for today's. So this topic is, we can talk about this entire semester. One of the class is like, we are covering this kind of stuff for the entire semesters, but we are going to have like short lectures today. So of course, I don't cover everything. I'm just going to briefly overview what's the effect of heat exposure on our body and exercise performance. Then we are going to talk about more practical considerations. That's we mostly spend time today. Okay, what is optimal temperature for marathon performers? I mean, this is a online lecture, so there's no interactions much, but in general, winning time for the marathon race, like ideal temperature is like 50 to 54 Fahrenheit, 10 to 12 Celsius. So that means it's too cold, it's not great, but too hot is not great either. So of course, there is a negative effect of the exercise in the heat, but which is not a topic, but there is also negative effect of cold environment too. So there is optimal range of the performance for the people can perform the best. So real world example, for example, World Athletics Championship that was happened in Qatar in 2019. This was, of course, the elite runners, but only 40% of the runner couldn't finish in the women's marathons, and 22% of the runner couldn't finish in the men's marathons. Again, this is the elite runners, and they trained entire years or like entire careers to perform the best in the World Championship or, of course, Olympics too. And even those like elite athletes, they couldn't finish this amount of runners because of the heat issues, even though they moved the start time to the midnight because of course, during the daytime, it was way hotter too. But even during the nighttime, it was really hot and they couldn't even finish. It's not the worst performance ever for them. They just couldn't purely finish. So that's the that's how much there is a negative impact of the heat. Of course, there is a major event held in the heat too, like World Athletics Championship this next year's in Tokyo. It's going to be hot. Soccer World Cup is coming to the US, Canada, Mexico 2026. It's going to be hot. 2028 Olympics in Los Angeles is hot. Okay, of course, Tokyo Olympics 2020, 2021 was hot too. And the Paris was hot, but it was not as hot as Tokyo, so people didn't talk much. But the other Olympics, Paris Olympics was really hot Olympics too. So again, as the climate change or global warming is like issues more and more in the entire world, major events is actually occurring in the heat a lot. So what's the negative impact of the heat really quickly? So of course, during the exercise, heart rate is going to be higher, cardiac output goes lower, stroke volume goes lower, and dehydration increase. These kind of negative impact of the acute response to the heat suffer the performance and the health for the athlete. Higher core temperature is the biggest factors. Higher core temperature by itself increase the fatigue and decrease exercise performance. Here on the left figure is the esophageal temperature, which is the core temperature, one of the core temperatures. And they had a different range of the temperatures here to start exercise, and they perform the exercise. Because of the cooling, they have a different level of the environment core temperatures. And the fatigue, it's core temperature by itself induced changed how long they can go to the exercise. So if the core temperature is lower, they can do the exercise longer in the heat. And of course, heart rate was lower when the core temperature was lower. Just they do the exact same exercise, but the difference is only the core temperature. So when core temperature was lower, they could exercise longer in the heat. Also, heart rate was longer. So core temperature plays an important role in our bodies, and which changed a lot of performance and also health. So but the muscle temperature is important. Like if the exercise duration is short, every 1 Celsius of the increase in the muscle temperatures improve 2 to 5% of the short duration exercise performance. As you can see here, so as muscle temperature goes higher, jump height is going to be higher and higher. Of course, there is a limit on the ceiling, so it's not like as temperature goes higher and higher, your performance keep increasing forever. Of course, there is a ceiling, but in general, as muscle temperature increase, the jump height increase, so which is important considerations. But as the core temperature increases, this positive relationship ceases and performance start impairing. So the higher mass temperature is important, but the higher core temperature is not great. That's something it's important to keep in mind. So high mass temperature increase performance when the performance is 10 to 30 seconds, so relatively short exercise. When the exercise duration goes longer and longer, like there is more chance to increase the core temperatures. And as I said, when the core temperature increases, that decrease the exercise performance and health factors. Okay, so short sprint, if it's only one time of the sprint, higher mass temperature increase. But for the most sports, of course, like it's not just performing one sprint. Like 100 meter, yes, it's only one sprint. But for most of the intermittent sports, they have to continuously repeat it sprint. And if that's the case, it's not like 10 to 30 seconds. So as core temperature increases as game goes on, that also decrease the performance and the neural factors that increase the risk of injury and stuff too. Again, so this is just the impact of the heat on the neuromuscular performance and the injury risk. So single voluntary activation doesn't really change by the heat exposures. However, the maximal voluntary contractions decrease with the hyperthermia. Hyperthermia means higher core temperatures. So when the higher core temperatures, the people suffers, the neural drive decrease, and neuromuscular performance decrease, which increase the injury risk. And this is due to the high core temperature, not the muscle or skin temperature. So again, the core temperature is important for the neuromuscular performance as well. As repeated sprint performed and the core temperature increase, a neural drive decrease, a neuromuscular performance decrease, and that decrease the neuromuscular performance, of course, force productions, those kind of stuff too. But at the same time, decreasing neuromuscular drive would increase the risk of injury, which is significant for the athlete. So hyperthermia, higher core temperatures, it's going to increase the injury risk, not just only the performance. And substrate utilizations. So in short, when we are exposing to the heat, we use glucose as a source of energy or muscle glycogen as a source of energy more than fat. So from the substrate standpoint, glucose and glycogen, muscle glycogen and glucose are the limiting factor of the performance for the most sports, especially intermittent sports. So we want to spare muscle glycogens or glucose use as much as possible, and we want to use a fat. However, when we were exposed to the heat, we use glucose or muscle glycogen as a source of energy more than fat, which is the issues. And also interesting stuff is you can see here on the left right corners of figures, when we are exposing to the heat, of course, for example, if we drink the sports drinks and trying to take the carbohydrate from the outside, we cannot use the carbohydrate sourcing outside as much when we are compared to when we are exercising in the cold. So we are using more muscle glycogen and glucose stored in the bodies, but at the same time, we cannot use more glucose and glycogen taking from outside either when we are exposing to the heat. So that's also some negative impact of exercise in the heat. So it's really short, quick, because this is not the main point of the conversations today, the lecture topics today. But in short, like not only one system, cardiovascular system, some regulatory system, neuromuscular system, and the energy system, and we didn't talk about the cognitive function, brain, all these kind of systems has a negative impact of the exposing to the heat during the exercise. And that's comprehensively decrease exercise performance and also increase the injury risk. It's not only one factor or one system of the body decrease exercise performance, it's comprehensively decrease exercise performance. Okay, performance decrement include endurance, sprint jump performance. If it's not one bout, skill, judgment, for example, like basketball shootings, the skill decrease by increasing the core temperature and also dehydration to judgment, cognitive function. It's not just a physiological factor, also like mood and motivation, those kind of psychological factor decrease to increase the fatigues. And for the most part, these all factors are important for pretty much all sports. It's not just only, one performance factor is only important for that particular sports. For the most part, all these factors are important for most sports. So that's why there is a huge impact of the exercise in the heat or hyperthermia and core temperatures. And when we talk about exercise in the heat or higher core temperatures, we tend to talk about only when we have a heat exposures. But our core temperatures or athlete core temperature can be higher even they are not exposed to the heat. Like for example, thermoneutral conditions, their core temperature can be higher, reach to the hyperthermias a lot, which is not normally recognized. But what they are doing is very intense and high volume work. If that's the case, core temperature goes higher and higher even without the heat exposures. So what we are talking apply not only when they are exposed to the heat, but also when they are performing high volume, high intensity exercise, which is most of the case for sports, even it's in the thermoneutral conditions. So this topic is very, very significant. It's not just only when we are exposed to the heat. So this is the main topic, how to mitigate the negative impact of the heat. Like, we talk about all negative stuff quickly, but the point is how to mitigate this. So that's the main conversation for today's. Okay, so these are the four main important heat mitigation strategies: fluid congestion, which is hydrations, coolings, heat acclimation, heat acclimatization, which is the main topic for today, and the aerobic fitness. So this is the meta-analysis. As you can see here, as the number goes higher, that means that heat mitigation strategy has a higher impact. And the aerobic fitness is important. Higher fit persons can tolerate to the heat or hyperthermia more than the less fit persons. But as everyone knows, increasing aerobic fitness takes time. So it's not something you can do quickly to mitigate the negative impact of the heat. And also, if it's highly trained athlete, their aerobic fitness is already high. So it's really hard to change. So considering those factors, that's why it's important to talk about hydration, cooling, and heat acclimation, the heat acclimatizations. And that's the topic for today. Okay, so what's the difference between heat acclimation and heat acclimatizations? You probably have heard these terms a lot. So both are the process of systematic and repeated heat exposure, which can induce the physiological, psychological, and performance adaptations. The process itself is going to be different. Heat acclimation is heat exposure from the artificial environment, like you can see on the left figures, like environmental chambers. We have environmental chambers at the Texas Tech University too, but this is the heat acclimations. On the other hand, heat acclimation is heat exposure from the natural environment. Any kind of outdoor exercise activities in the heat is going to be heat acclimatizations. So that methodological differences is the difference between heat acclimation and heat acclimatizations, but the process and is the same. Okay, so this is the traditional timeline of heat acclimation adaptations. So short-term heat acclimation is considered to be less than 7 days. Medium term is 7 to 13 days. Long term is longer than 14 days. So the reason I'm saying traditional timeline of the heat acclimation adaptation is if the type of exercise performing during the heat or the magnitude of the heat is different, the adaptation is going to be different. So this is more general adaptations. That's why I'm saying traditional timelines. Timeline could be different if the heat exposure level is different. So first adaptation you normally see is the heart rate. You can start seeing the performance adaptation, heart rate adaptation in 2 to 3 days, sometimes 5 days. Then next one you're going to start seeing like some summer temperature, summer comfort, which are perceptual adaptations. You start seeing some adaptation in the core temperatures. You start seeing adaptation in skin temperatures. And typically sweat rate is the latest adaptation. So it takes just a little bit longer time than the other adaptation to occur. And the other, as all the physiological adaptation occurs, the performance adaptation you can see here is increase in performance capacities. The other adaptations that can happen from the heat acclimation is Decrease in the sweat electrolyte concentrations somewhere between 5 to 10 days. And the perceived exhaustion, for example, RP also decrease even they are performing the same exercise. So sweat rate, the heart rate goes lower first, then adaptation in the core temperature goes lower, skin temperature lowers, and plasma volumes increase into, and sweat rate increase, sweat electrolyte concentration decrease, and you perceive the exhaustion decrease, you feel easier to perform, and as these adaptations happen, exercise performance increase too. But the point is 75 to 80% of the adaptation occur first 4 to 7 days. That's the biggest difference between, for example, like altitude adaptations. Like adaptation type of adaptation is different, but altitude trainings really needs longer than 2 to 3 weeks in general. But the heat acclimation can happen very quickly compared to the other environmental stress. 4 to 7 days, you can see most of the adaptations. And heat acclimation exercise performance, this is also the heat meta-analysis we did. So as bigger number indicate more impact. But the point here is any kind of like performance metrics like VO2 max, time to exhaustions, how much you can perform exercise in the heat, time trials. Those kind of endurance type of exercise performance increase, but also mean power, peak powers, those kind of power performance also increase by the heat acclimation. Of course, if it's only one bout of exercise, it doesn't really help anything. But if you perform the powers production repeatedly, which is the most of the case for the sports, for example, sprinting, you can see the performance improvement by the heat acclimations. So there is a lot of like implications, good implications from the heat acclimations. Heat acclimation typically used to increase the performance exercise in the heat, but also they can increase the performance in the cool environment too. So as you can see here on the left side, it's VO2 max, and right side, time trial performance. Experimental group is the one performed the heat acclimation. Control group, same training in a thermoneutral environment. So they didn't receive the heat exposure. And the performance test was performed in a cool environment and hot environment. And the black bar is a pre-heat acclimation. The white bar is a post-acclimation. And as you can see here, experimental group, which is a group receiving the heat acclimations, increased the VO2 max and time trial compared to pre and post testings, both in a cold environment and hot environments. But the control group, they didn't improve both in the cool and hot environment for both VO2 max and the time trial performance. So heat acclimation can be used to increase the exercise performance, not only in the heat, but also in the cool environment. That's why people started using this as part of their training process. For example, Manchester City has heat chambers. They are doing some trainings there too. Other teams, like some teams and the college teams, started using heat acclimations to improve the overall fitness and also performance in the cool environment, not just to prepare for the heat exposures. Like almost like you're going to the weightlifting room doing the lifting to train strength, power, and the muscular endurance type of stuff, doing the heat training to improve the performance in the sport-specific situations. And I'm just going to touch this heat acclimation, heat and the hydration. This is really interesting concept. So as I said, heat acclimation increased the sweat rate. Higher sweat rate increase the dehydrations. However, like when you are after the heat acclimations, even so, thirst level is going to be lowered. So this is black bar is a pre-heat acclimations, and the gray bar is a post-heat acclimation. Sweat rate increase, of course, that's adaptations. The body mass loss increased if we prescribe the same amount of waters. If they drink more, this is going to be different. But if they drink the same amount at the pre and post testings, post heat acclimation, percent body mass loss is going to be higher because they are losing more sweat. So even so, thirst level is going to be lowered after the heat acclimations. Even they are losing more body hydration because of sweat rate is higher. So that means when our athlete adapt to the heat, thirst sensation goes lower. And hydration is not a topic today, so I'm not going to cover too much, but there is a huge negative impact of the dehydration on the performance. and also like injury risk and the physiological factor and the psychological factor. So maintain the good hydration status is extremely important, especially exercise in the heat. But it's not only exercise in the heat. So if you are just following thirst sensation to drinks, after your body adapt to the heat, you don't feel as thirst as you were before heat acclimation, which is important considerations in order to maintain the hydration status. And we touch about the substrate utilization, so I'm just gonna touch just a little bit quickly. So after the heat acclimations, the athlete use less glucose as a source of energy, which is good. So you can see here, muscle glycogen use was really low compared to the pre-acclimation and post-acclimation status, which is good. As I said, for the most of the performance limiting factor for the substrate standpoint is glucose or muscle glycogen. So sparing or saving muscle glycogen is extremely important. That's one of the important adaptations for the heat acclimations as well. Since we talk about the neuromuscular functions, I'm going to talk about just a little bit how the heat acclimation increase torque, voluntary activation, the EMG and stuff. So this is a pre-heat acclimations, and this is a post-acclimation, and they perform the trainings or testings, neuromuscular performance testing, both in the cool environment and heat environments. So the point is torque and voluntary activations increase following the post-acclimation during both heat exposure and non-heat exposures, which of course performance purpose, they can produce more force and the neuromuscular performance increase indicated by voluntary increase in the voluntary activations. But that this is not just only during the excess heat exposure, but also in a cool environment as well. So that it decreases the injury risk. So heat acclimations could be important approach to decrease the injury risk as well, not just only the increase in the performance, also not just only during the heat exposures too. Okay, so how to make a plans? Higher internal body temperature is really a key to induce the heat acclimations adaptations. So hyperthermia, sweat, and skin blood flow. So in order to increase the adaptations, you need to increase the hyperthermia, so increase the core temperature during the adaptation process, and inducing the sweat, and also increase the skin blood flow, which is important. So these factors can be controlled by, for example, exercise intensity. If you increase exercise intensity, you can increase core temperatures, or you can increase sweat, or you can increase blood flow, or durations is also important. Even higher exercise intensity is high. If exercise duration is 30 seconds, it doesn't do anything. So you have to do exercise in decent amount of time in order to increase the core temperature, induce the sweat and skin blood flow. And the environmental condition can be something like you can control too. If the environmental condition is severe, it's easier to increase the core temperatures, induce the sweat and skin blood flow as well. And exercise modalities, like running is easier to increase these kind of factors compared to the cycling. Of course, if you want to do the cycling, which is fine, and doing the heat trainings as part of the recovery process, so we don't want to stress the bodies, like especially joint, which is fine to use the cyclings. But the cycling is really hard to increase the hyperthermia or sweat or skin blood flow compared to the running. So if it's fine, like it's easier to use running as a modalities compared to the cycling in order to increase the enough adaptations. Different method of heat acclimation, self-paced exercise. This is like almost like heat acclimatization. So you're just performing sports-specific activity. And that's the heat acclimatization exercise modalities. And you're just doing the training in the heat outside. And constant work rate, performing set intensity exercise. For example, running at 12 kilometers per hour or something like that. But the issue of this method is it's same as the trainings. Like overload is extremely important. Our bodies, as everyone knows, our body is amazing to adapt to the stress. So if you keep providing the same stimulus, our body adapt, and the degree of the adaptations is not going to be higher because the stress level is different day 1 versus day 7, for example, after adapting some extent, even they are performing the same exercise absolute intensities. So that's the negative impact, negative side of this constant work rate. And control intensity exercise is exercise based on the same set internal response. For example, 80% heart rate max or something like that. So as the body adapts, like you can change the absolute exercise intensity based on the response to the our bodies, which induce the overload, which is great. So overload is necessary not only just for the trainings, general training, like strength conditioning training, but also heat trainings. Overload is extremely important because our body used to that stimulus. And controlling hyperthermia is like maintain core temperature around 38.5. And the hyperthermic zone is maintain core temperature around 38.5 to 39.99, just a little bit higher core temperatures to maintain. And the first these two control hyperthermic zone method is more focused on the core temperatures and the change in the exercise intensity based on the core temperatures response. And the passive heating, I get a lot of questions about the passive heating because you don't have to stress your bodies, you don't have to do extra exercise, but if you can induce a heat acclimation or not. Like hot water immersion sauna, we are going to talk more in details about this in the next slide. But passive heating could work too. Length is 5 to 14 days. It depends on the magnitude of the heat stimulus, or you have to think about a lot of other factors in the practical settings because it's not just athletes that are doing the heat acclimation, the heat acclimatization trainings. They are performing sport-specific trainings, so you have to think about the balance between trainings and other heat acclimations or adaptations as well. And duration could be somewhere 60 minutes to 90 minutes. 60 minutes is, I would say, the minimum because you need decent amount of heat exposures in order to increase the core temperature and the sweat and the skin blood flow. Right, so this is the level of the adaptations. Because it's easier to stimulate bodies, full exercise with the heat exposure can induce the most adaptations. But it's not all or nothing. So it's not like 100%. If it's not 100%, you don't have to do it or you shouldn't do it. Like small amount of adaptations is helpful to increase the performance or mitigate the injury risk or heat genesis risk. So it's not all or nothing. It's better to do something. So if that's the case, partial exercise heat exposure with the alternative method. So you can do some exercise, but the shorter durations, then you can do the alternative method. For example, sauna, hot bath, those kind of like non-exercise modality. And the next adaptations is exercise in the temperate with the alternative method. So you can perform the exercise in the temperate conditions, and you can increase the core temperature just a little bit, decent amount. It's not as much as like exercise in the heat, but you can still increase the core temperature. Then you are going to perform alternative method, for example, sauna or hot bath. And number 4 is alternative method, just sauna or hot bath and without exercise. And number 5 is normal trainings. Again, like even it's level 4 alternative methods, it's better to do it like over not doing it. So it's not just again all or nothing situations. It's better to do something, depend on the situations, depend on the availabilities and other training situations type of stuff. And the recovery is extremely important following heat acclimation too, because heat acclimation induces the fatigue, heat adaptation, heat exposure induces the fatigues. So recovery maximizes the exercise performance. But too much recovery or when an individual discontinues heat exposure for a long time, adaptation fade away, which is the decades. So this study is really interesting. They performed the heat exposure, same exercise heat exposure for 12 days first. So this is the end of core temperatures. And they just purely perform the 3 days of the recovery. They perform the same exercise. After the 3 days of the recovery, their end temperatures is dropped this much. So this means the recovery induced extra adaptations. From day 1 to day 12, they induced adaptations, but also they dramatically induce more adaptations after 3 days of the recovery. But if they discontinue the adaptation, the adaptation is fading out or fading over time, which is a decay, which is one of the biggest issues of the heat acclimation, which we talk more in detail later. But again, the point is, recovery is necessary in order to increase the adaptations. But too much recovery or resting period is also bad because that's dissipate lose adaptations. So you have probably seen these figures from the trainings, normal training adaptation, tapering and detrainings. Well, brief period, it's tapering. You can decrease the volumes, somewhere 40 to 60%, depending on the situations. You can maximize the performance. This is tapering is the process of the peakings. And if it's brief period, you can maximize the performance. But if we, as everyone knows, if the resting period or tapering period is too long, it's not going to be maximize the performance. You instead inducing the trainings. It's same concept applied to the heat. It's not exact same. It's not just like this is only for the training. This is also same as the heat adaptations too. So in the general adaptations, after the trainings, your fatigue level is higher, but fitness level is higher. But the net balance of the performance is not super high because still you have a high fatigue levels. But the speed, the fatigue is dissipating is way faster than like decreasing the fitness levels. So if you perform some recovery times, your fatigue level goes lower, but you can still maintain high fitness because it takes time to lose fitness levels compared to fatigues. That's why you can increase the performance. You can maximize performance by providing the recovery. It's same concept applied to heat acclimations. You need to dissipate the fatigue to maximize the adaptations. But if you have a too long period without heat acclimations, you also start losing the adaptation. So you start losing also the performance factors as well. So how to prevent the decay, which is the loss of the adaptations by not providing the heat adaptations. But you don't want to induce the fatigue before the competition, of course. So this is the concept is like intermittent heat exposure. We studied this too. The concept of the intermittent heat training is you after the heat acclimations, you perform once a week or twice a week of the heat exposures to maintain the adaptations. So it was actually successful when we did the studies. And twice a week or once a week can maintain the adaptation in the performance for 8 weeks. And you can also maintain the adaptation in the heart rate and the rectal temperature for 8 weeks. There's individual variabilities. Some people, it's enough to perform once a week, but some person needs like 2 times a week. It just depends on the individual variabilities. But in general, heart rate, rectal temperature, and the time trial performance can be maintained for up to 8 weeks if you perform once a week or twice a week of heat exposures after the heat acclimations. So this is just scenarios like how you can use as an example in the real settings. You don't want to do the heat acclimation too close to the competitive seasons because you don't want to see the fatigues. So you can, for example, perform like 7 days of the heat acclimation, like 5-6 weeks before the competitive season start. And since then, you can perform intermittent heat exposure once a week to maintain the adaptations. If it's once a week of the heat exposure, you don't accumulate the fatigues. And you can also focus on other sports-specific training that necessary leading up to the competitive seasons. And after the competitive season start, you can still keep performing the intermittent heat exposures once a week to maintain the performance adaptations throughout the seasons. As I say, the heat acclimations help not only exercise in the heat, but also in the cool environment. So for the training purpose, it's important to maintain the adaptations, not just because to mitigate the negative impact of the heat, and also in injury prevention and the heat health as well. The reason I have like intermittent heat trainings after the competition start and the day here is, for example, like you can perform intermittent heat exposure as part of the like recovery process. Like typically that most of the team perform the recovery session the day after the competitions, like games. And you can just perform the intermittent heat trainings or low recovery aerobic exercise like in the heat instead of doing the thermoneutrals. So that's maintain the heat adaptation, but also you don't have to increase other unnecessary workload for the athlete in order to just maintain the heat acclimation. So this is just the one scenario that I normally use in this kind of situation. The other factors like we have to consider is the balance between sport-specific activity and heat acclimations. And heat acclimations performing in the artificial environment could be additional workload because like heat acclimation is outside of the actual sports-specific trainings. But so you may need to decrease the sports-specific activity during the heat acclimation period because they are doing extra work outside of the sports-specific trainings. That's another reason you don't want to do the heat acclimations immediately before the competitive seasons, and you want to do like 5-6 weeks apart, far from the competitive season, and you want to maintain. But probably heat acclimation can induce a great adaptations if we use correctly because you can monitor everything, you can control everything, and normally heat acclimation can induce a higher stimulus. That's why you can see the great adaptations. On the other side, like heat acclimatizations is like you are performing the exercise in a whole environment with the sport-specific activities. So there's no additional workload that you have. And may not greatest adaptation because you cannot control some stuff, so you might not be able to induce adaptations as much as you can from the heat acclimations. There are a lot of like factors you cannot control. So need to adjust in the time and training depends on the situations. You might have to like control. You cannot control the environmental condition that you can from the heat acclimation. So you might have to change the time of the practice depends on how much stimulus you want to provide, like training regimens to. So it's super important, regardless, like monitor workload recovery and response and incorporate into the training program you like here. It's not just you perform the exercise in the heat. You have to monitor what they are doing, regardless of the situation, heat acclimatizations, and you have to comprehensively tackle and change and incorporate into the sports-specific training plans. The concept here, the another concept is heat acclimatization is not enough for the most part because sometimes it doesn't provide a higher stimulus. But you don't want to do the heat acclimations, full heat acclimation because that's too much exercise. If that's the case, why not? We are going to combine heat acclimatization and heat acclimations. And because they have to train in the heat, especially during the summers for the most sports. So that could be the heat acclimatizations. And then you don't have to do the full heat acclimation session, but if you do some heat acclimations after the training in the heat, in the natural environment, maybe you can actually induce a further adaptation. You might be able to maximize the adaptation. And that's what we did. And in short, and inducing the heat acclimations after the heat acclimatizations actually induce the further adaptations. Like in the temperature, extra temperature goes lower further, heart rate goes lower further, and sweat rate increase more, and the time trial performance decreased as well. So even it's like this is really practical approach because most of the sports they have to do training outside anyways. But if that's not enough to maximize the adaptations, you can do a few days of the heat acclimations to top off. So this is another situation, heat acclimatization plus heat acclimation scenarios. So let's say if you have 3 weeks of the summer training, 1 to 3, and after the summer training, you can do a few days of the heat acclimation. You don't have to do the full 7 days or 10 days. You can do a few days, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 days. Then since then, you can do this intermittent heat training to maintain the adaptation. This is the same scenario as the last ones after the starting the competition, just once a week to maintain the adaptations. But the difference is like inducing part. You are already doing some training in the heat and in the natural environment. So you're just going to do some extra trainings on top of this in the artificial environment from the heat acclimation to maximize the adaptations. This is what we did for the USA women's national team for the Tokyo Olympics. So they actually performed the trainings in Texas. They had a training camp in Texas. Then they came to the University of Connecticut for doing the trainings in the heat in the artificial environment, which we did. Then they headed to the Tokyo. So this scenario was like combine the heat acclimatization to the heat acclimations. So actually, we did a few days of the heat acclimations. We still improved. We still saw some improvement in the athlete response to the heat. So it worked out. Like, of course, June in Texas is already hot here. You can see there is a training camp. But since we saw some trainings in the heat or trainings, heat acclimation training in Connecticut from the few days, that means this heat acclimatization probably was not enough to maximize the adaptations. And then, but we didn't have to do the full heat acclimation training to prepare the Olympics in Tokyo, because they already did some trainings in Texas. They already had some adaptations, which was what we did. And this is the another scenarios I worked with. This was for the Paris Olympics. I was working for the Japanese teams these times. This was the men's teams. And the next slide is actually the Paris Olympics and the games. This is the qualifiers for the Paris Olympics. It was in Qatar in April. The situation was really complicated. Players were playing in the cool conditions, but the Qatar was already hot. So we had to prepare some heat exposures, heat mitigation strategies. So what we did was we asked athletes to perform some heat exposures as much as they can do before coming to the training camp. Ask a few times, exercise 60 minutes in a heated room if they can. If they cannot, passive heating like sauna, hot bath after exercise at their own teams. Or if that's not even possible, just doing the hot sauna or hot bath 45 minutes. And a lot of players actually did it before actually joining the trainings. The reason we asked was we didn't have enough, time to actually fully prepare to the before the first game, because the training camp was relatively short before the game start. And also 1 month long tournament. So you have to actually think about training load management as a whole. It's not just only the heat adaptations. If we, for example, so this is the heat, this is the training times. And this is the heat load that we plan, load to moderate to high, load to high, low. And this is the training load based on the coaches' decisions too. But the point here is we don't have to go each by each. And this is just an example. But let's say if you wanted to have a full adaptation, just you only consider the heat, you probably have to have a high training load, high heat stimulus with a high training intensities here too. But if that's the case, you probably induce more fatigues. And if net balance is going to be probably negative slightly, even you have more heat adaptations. So the approach we took was, okay, let's say if the first game, it's fine to adapt to the heat, let's say if it's 80% or 75%. This is just a concept. We don't know if it's 75% or 80%. It's just easier for us to explain to the coach. But instead, we don't have to accumulate too much fatigues, compared to the time we just only focus on the heat trainings. So net balance, the performance is going to be higher here in that case. I mean, at the end of the day, heat acclimation is in order to increase the performance. And if the heat acclimations increase the fatigue, which decrease the fatigue as a whole, and if the performance was lower in the game, that doesn't mean anything. That's not the purpose. So let's say even heat training was not max 100% at the first game. Since the short duration of the training times, it's important to not inducing the fatigue before 2 times a week over the game for 1 month. So what we did was we try to maximize or achieve the peak for the heat acclimation for the second games, but we took the approach that we don't induce too much fatigues from the trainings. And this is actually the Olympics games. Players in Europe were in the preseason, so they didn't have a heat adaptations as much. But the players in Japan were in seasons, and they actually trained or played in the heat. So the focus players in Japan were mostly dissipating the heat. Players in Europe were inducing the heat trainings, but also not accumulating the fatigue. That was the goals. And this time we had 2 weeks. So our goal was 100% heat adaptation at the first game here. And at the same time, it's important as fresh as possible at the first game because it's Olympics. It's only 16 teams are playing in the Olympics. All games are competitive compared to the qualifiers. And they have a twice a week of the games throughout the 1 month long tournament. So it's important to maximize adaptation going full 100% from the first game because they had longer preparation periods, and you can manipulate heat load and the training load in order to achieve both at the max level. So the point is, you cannot think about heat training and the sport specific training totally separate. You have to consider both same together, and you're going to integrate both together and think about how to maximize the performance as a whole. That's the approach we normally take. And lastly, training individualization is extremely important. Traditional group approach might not be appropriate. Individual assessment might be important. Individual approach is really important, especially if you're working with the elite athlete, because response and adaptation to the heat are very different. Each individual different. So required dose and training and recovery is most likely different. So individualization is really important and it's same as trainings, but individualization for the heat adaptation is extremely important. At the end of the day, it's like when I talk to the coach or this is some selling point. It's so important. It's how much athletes have to train in order to increase the performance of the 1%. They have to train a lot in order to increase. But heat acclimation and heat acclimatization can easily change the performance by more than 1% if you do well. And you have to be very much flexible, and you have to think about a lot of factors together in order to maximize the performance as a whole and also prevent the injury. It's not just think about the heat acclimation, the trainings. You have to think about everything together. Be flexible and talk to the coach. You cannot just I cannot just providing my evidence or opinions. I have to be flexible. I have to adjust based on what coach wants to do as well. Okay, so that's it. Thank you so much for listening. And if you want to do what we were doing, and I appreciate if you are following our social media and stuff. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Yasuki. That was incredible. We have a couple questions in the chat. I
Yep.
can just start reading them off.
Sounds good.
So the first question is from Andy. He asked, how quickly do you lose adaptations?
Yeah, so that's great question. So it's really depend on the person's performance wise. Start losing in general average 2 weeks after with non-heat exposures. Sometimes you probably lose for the most part in 1 month. That's the timelines. Physiological adaptation. Some people start losing 1 week or 2 weeks slightly. And you start seeing more and more adaptations as time goes. So, but in average, the performance is like you start seeing the performance decrement in 2 weeks. So if it's within 2 weeks, it should be fine.
Got it. And the minimal effective dose, is that 1 to 2 times a week that you're saying?
Yeah. So after you induce the heat acclimation and heat acclimatizations, in order to maintain once a week or twice a week is enough. But in order to induce, if you want to induce once a week or twice a week is not important, is not enough. After inducing the adaptations, in order to maintain once a week or twice a week is enough to maintain.
Awesome. Thank you. Second question from Benjamin is, when training tactical athletes such as firefighters, would training in personal protective equipment cause heat acclimation that is transferable to improved performance? Or would the decrease in sustainable intensity during exercise caused by that equipment result in negligible outcomes for heat mitigation?
That's great question. So yeah, so I know I talked about the sports settings a lot today, but I work with like occupational tactical athlete or military or like firefighters who, in these areas as well, which is great questions. And that's some question that I often get as well. So Clothing is really helpful to induce adaptations because without increasing the workload, you can increase the core temperatures, which is necessary for the heat acclimation adaptations. So during the acclimation process, of course, you have to be careful about not increasing the core temperature too much, but having extra clothes is actually helpful. And sometimes we intentionally do it because you can increase the core temperature without increasing the workload. So during the heat acclimation process, if you want to induce adaptation, having a clothes is probably helpful. But if you just only think about like mitigation, maintain the adaptations, maybe once a week or something to have the clothes on is also helpful to maintain the adaptation purpose. But when we only think about the negative impact of the heat exposure acute response, like having the clothes is actually working for the negative purpose because that decrease the performance because that increase the core temperatures. So the two totally different conversations and the two different scenarios. When we discuss the heat acclimation adaptations or maintains adaptations, clothes probably help. But when we discuss outside of that kind of concept, talking about the negative impact of the heat exposures on particular response, yes, clothes has a negative impact.
Awesome, thank you. Andy asked, what's the best way for most people to measure core temperature during heat acclimation?
Great question. So rectal temperature is the gold standard, one of the gold standard we use in the lab settings, but that's not feasible in the practical settings. So we use the pills. So pills, the athletes swallow the pills 6-8 hours before the games or trainings. Then you measure the core temperature like through the Bluetooth, like in non-invasive ways. That's the way to go, the most accurate ones. But that also still costs sometimes. So that's why we are working with the Air Force right now and validating and developing the device to assess the core temperature in non-invasive ways. So those kind of techniques is under development right now. But as of today, the core temperature, three valid method is esophageal, which is clinical settings, like type of assessment, rectal temperature, and ingestible pills. Some people like that's the three ways to assess. It's sometimes hard to assess the core temperature in the field settings. So I didn't present this in the lectures because of the time sake. We did some studies and we used some predictive modelings. So if we see the adaptations in the sweat rate and the summer sensations, so they feel lower, heat exposures perceptually. And if you see the adaptations in the heart rate, if you see all adaptations, you most likely see the adaptation in the core temperatures too. But that's just tracking the adaptation of the core temperature. It's not something you can see the dose of the heat exposure during the trainings. That's also another issues. But if you only think about the adaptation to the heat, you can see from the you can assume the core temperature adaptation from the other adaptations metrics too.
Got it. What have you personally found to work better, the esophageal method or the pill method when assessing core temp?
Esophageal is both accurate, both valid, which is fine. But I mean, esophageal is the invasive ways, and it's so hard to use it during the exercise. So if it's lab settings, I use the rectal temperature. If it's field settings, I use the ingestible pills.
Got it. Is there a certain company that you found to work best with the with the ingesting pills?
Yeah, so there are two companies, major company. One is in Boston, one is in France, and I use the body cap companies which is based in France right now, and you can track the everything on individual base, or you can see like 4 or 5 athletes on one monitors at the same times.
Oh wow, that's really cool. Okay. The next question is from me. It was, how do you assess the individual variabilities between athletes to know whether you want to dose 1 time a week or 2 time a week
That
to maintain?
that's a great question. If it's highly trained athlete, most likely once a week is good. So, like, of course, twice a week is harder to do it to integrate in actual training programs. So I would say start with once a week if you are working with high elite athlete. Then if you start seeing some like loss of the adaptation because you are going to track what they are doing during the intermittent heat trainings too, then you are going to back up to the 2 hours a week or something. That's probably the way to go. During the heat acclimation inductions, you normally start seeing the adaptation in 2 to 3 days. And some athletes don't show the adaptation in 2 to 3 days with that particular stimulus you provide. If that's the case, that probably athlete needs just a little bit more higher, greater stress of the heat exposure. If that's the case, I increase the stimulus. So just based on seeing the adaptations, then like you're going to change the, dose of the adaptations based on the individual response.
Got it. Braden asked, what tools or measures would you recommend as part of your heat acclimation management plan to manage workload? For example, core temp monitors, physiological biomarkers, environmental monitors, uh, pre-cooling strategies, and post-cooling strategies.
Yeah, that's great questions. Of course, like a core temperature is necessary. I would say, if it's in the lab settings, if it's field settings, depend on the situations, because core temperature is the one you can see the dose response, like from the heat exposure standpoint. But at the same time, you have to monitor overall workload management. You have to measure overall workloads. It's not just only what you are doing in the heat, but also in the sport specific trainings too. So that's also part of, like, let's say if you are doing the workload monitorings for the sport specific training, you have to do the same things in heat training as well. So you can capture the overall workload. It's not just only sport specific trainings. And the cooling is really good questions. I often get the questions as well. So some people use cooling in order to help promote the recoveries, but higher core temperature is important to induce adaptation. So if the competition is far, and if your focus is just a little bit more heat adaptation over recoveries, I normally ask coach to have time just a little bit after the trainings before doing the cooling. So you can have just a little bit more period to have a higher core temperature. But when the competition gets closer or during the seasons, the recovery is more important than the heat acclimation adaptation, because at that point they already have adaptations. If that's the case, I normally tell coach or athletic trainers you can do the cooling immediately following the exercise or competitions, because recovery is more important at that point. So it's really dependent on the case, but that's really good questions.
Awesome. Nolan asked, what tools or devices can athletes use before performance that will help increase performance, like a heating or cooling massage gun? Any other tools you've seen to be great? During performance, when they get a break on the bench in basketball, for example, what should they use? Cold products to decrease core temperature or heat products to keep muscles warm? Any devices in particularly that are good for this?
That's really great questions. I think that's based on it's scenario by scenarios. For example, I'm coming back to the basketball later, but like, for example, if it's soccer or something, if you are doing exercise in the heat, like after the warming up, you decrease the core temperature slightly, it's probably more important. In order try not to decrease the muscle temperature too much, but the lower core temperature is really important because the competition is long and in the heat. And during the halftime, you're trying to do some cooling as well. So cooling is probably more important. But the basketball is typically played in under the ACs. So a core temperature doesn't increase as much as like performing exercise in the heat. So you don't probably want to do the coolings in that kind of environment. So the recovery and readiness standpoint, but you don't have to increase the muscle temperatures by heating part or anything, even if it's the basketball under the AC, because warming up is typically enough. That might be something it's really important, like, or interesting, like to look at what the core temperature actually is during the basketball games. That's really interesting point. From the recovery and readiness standpoint, like nutritions, hydrations, and sleep are the most important stuff. So that's three stuff like you really need to focus on first. Then if they are all good, then they can start something different too. That's my general approach, and that's really important because those are the three key factors to do it. But again, like it's really case by case. If you are exercising in the heat, the decrease in the core temperature is probably the focus. So performing the pre-cooling, the halftime cooling is really important to the extent that doesn't drop too much of the muscle temperatures, but decrease the core temperatures. But if you are performing under the AC like basketball, you don't have to do the coolings after the warming up or half times. But that heat training still help the performance because that mitigate the increase in the core temperature during the games, and also heat training increase the performance in the cool environment as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Yasuki. All your responses have been super thorough. I think that's our last question. I just want to thank you for your time and your insight. This has been really awesome. And I know I personally learned a lot. I previously thought of like heat acclimation as like more so to improve performance in the heat. I didn't realize it helps in the cool as well. So this is opening a ton of possibilities for how I might be able to implement it too.
Yeah, that's great. I'm glad. Like, I could provide some informations.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Well, thank you so much, everyone in the chat. If you please follow Dr. Yasuki on those follows if you want to get in contact with him as well as his lab. And that's all we got. Thank you.
Thank you so much.